This video is all about cross-hatching. We'll start with some simple line technique, move into some theory about how and where to place your lines, and then we'll bring it all together in a finished rendered figure drawing. I'm David Finch. I've been a comic book artist for over 25 years for Marvel Comics, DC Comics, and many others, and over the years I've drawn just about every character you can possibly imagine.
So with cross-hatching, before we get into how to use it and where to use it and the different effects that we can get from it, I wanted to talk about just the simple line itself. And the way that I approach my cross-hatching is I'll just create a bit of a ball. And this is with a pencil. With a pen, you can actually just add a little bit of pressure and then draw your line up from there. But with a pencil, because I can't do that, I just create a bit of a ball and then ease my pencil out from there. And notice that I'm using the same basic line length, the same slight curvature to the line, and the same distance between my lines. So if I go a little tighter with it, that's fine, but it's something I need to keep consistent as I go along. And when you do any cross-hatching on your picture, it'll be far more effective if you can be as consistent with your line as possible. And so I can curve and start to go in a different direction. I can start to go longer, and all those sorts of different things work, but it needs to be a consistent line all the way through. And it's very easy to just start throwing lines kind of willy-nilly and end up with a bit of a mess. And so you really want to just practice. A good method that I've found, if you draw a circle just like this, you can actually start to cross-hatch across it, start at one end of the circle, and then draw your line out to the other end, and just get comfortable with controlling your line length and being consistent. And it's a good exercise just to get a little bit of a hand control. Another thing that's very important to bear in mind is just the direction of your hand. For me, I tend to have the easiest time drawing outward with my hand this way, along the path of my arm. If I try and go this way, I'm really fighting against my natural arm movement. I can actually use my wrist that way, and I'll do that here. And so here, I'm not using my arm at all, I'm just using my wrist, and that works. I can't use my wrist going this way, but I can actually come under it and use my wrist this way. And you'll find that there are easier ways and there are more difficult ways for you to draw your lines. And so when you're drawing, I would recommend that if I've got lines coming up through here, I'll just curve my page and then work in a way that's more natural for my hand. This is something you really need to experiment with. I'm a left-handed artist, and so my natural hand movement will probably be different from yours if you're right-handed, or maybe even different from yours if you're left-handed. Whatever it is that you're more comfortable with, that's the way that you should really work. And it's something, I think the best way to figure that out is just to experiment with the line, experiment with your wrist, and see what works for you. Generally speaking though, I find that most artists have the best line control and the easiest time working just going outward with the hand at about a 45-degree angle, just like this. And so I would consider that to be a good default. All right. So now we're going to get into how to start using our rendering on actual forms and the way to make it work the most effectively. And for the first example that I'm going to show, I've got a simple plane. I've got my lighting coming from here downward toward the plane. And so I've got a shadow away from the light here and a shorter shadow away from the light here. I've got a much softer curve here and a much harder curve here. And for the softer curve, I'm going to use much longer rendering. I have a tendency to go back and forth between calling my cross-hatching or rendering. So if I slip and call it rendering, just bear in mind that I mean cross-hatching. It's all the same thing. And so you can see what I'm doing is just creating a graduation of light from my shadow to my light source, and I'm following the form. And because the graduation of shadow is much softer here, I go with a much longer line. So let me just finish this out. It's very important that I make sure, if I want to create this effect, that I go all the way through with my cross-hatching. If I stop at any one place, it would break the effect and make it look like I've got a harder plane and a softer plane. And you really need to control your plane changes with your rendering. And so now I'm going to go in with a much harder plane change here. And so as a result, my rendering is much, much shorter. And it's a very, very abrupt change from dark to light. If I wanted something to be completely abrupt, I wouldn't add any cross-hatching at all. This is a good way to soften your form just slightly, but without blowing it out. And you can see if I went really long with my rendering, I'm really destroying that effect right away. And I'm actually creating something that looks much more like a texture than like a transition from dark to light. And that's why I see this quite a bit in cross-hatching on figures. Things can start to look a little textured and odd, and it's because very long render lines, very long cross-hatching lines are going deep into the light from very hard forms. So something to bear in mind with cross-hatching is there are a lot of different types of lines that we can use depending on the effect that we're trying to get. So my most basic sort of line starts with a bit of a ball. Now this is because I'm using a pencil. It's impossible for me to get a thin to thick with pressure like I could with a quill or a brush. And so I just draw out a bit of a ball and then drag my line out from there. And this is the type of line that I would use, generally speaking, coming from a shadow. And so if I've got a shadow here, I would use these sorts of lines to transition from my shadow toward the light. Another type of line that I can use is actually just taking this line as my basis and then coming out both sides. So I'm just softening the line out, dragging it out the other way. Another very common technique that I like to use is just a bit of a broken line. So I'll take what I already have here and I'll just break it. And this gives it a bit of a texture and it can lend a real airiness to your cross-hatching. So you can cover a larger area without it getting really oppressive looking. And that's really all it is. It gives you a bit of a feeling of texture depending on the type of surface that you're looking for. I think I'm going just a little bit light here. It's a little difficult to see. That's really the concept there. Another way that I can crosshatch is just using something that's a much more uneven kind of broken up line. And this is easier for me to achieve actually with a pen that has a bit of a thin to thick capability. And so I'm going to do this with a pencil, just balling up my line here and there, changing up the direction and just giving it some character. And this is great for an old dirty wall or rust or those kinds of effects. Breaking up the line, shaking it around. And quickly, I'll show you the same effect with a pen. It's much easier for me to get that. You can see I'm not having to go back over my line. I'm just increasing and decreasing the pressure as I go. Now in this next example, I've got a light source coming from above to the left here. I always use essentially an omnidirectional light. So I'm not using a pin light where I've got light radiating out like this from it. I'm using if I use a light source, my light will go in the same direction over the entire image. It just makes things much, much easier to keep consistent across an entire image. And so I'm going to light my sphere away from my light source. I'm not using any bounce light for this. We're keeping this as simple as possible. And I highly recommend when you're learning how to draw to avoid things like bounce light and just use a single directional light in just hard shadows. And now, because my light source is coming from here, it's very easy for me to figure out on the sphere below where my shadow is going to fall. And it's going to be just about like this. And this isn't rendering, this is a bit of a shadow theory, but the reason I'm showing this example is a very common problem that I see with rendering is rendering out of cast shadows. And so that's something I really wanted to cover and try and come up with an example that would describe it in the best, most succinct, easy way possible. And so I'm rendering from my form shadow on the sphere here toward the light. I'm making sure to be consistent with it all the way around. And now my cast shadow is going to be entirely hard because the sphere is obscuring the light here and here completely. If I was to render out of this form, and this is something I see people do quite a bit, I'm going to render out of my cast shadow. You can see I'm actually rendering into where the light would be hitting. My light would be hitting this area here. And so it actually really destroys the illusion. And it's something you really need to be aware of. So for instance, on a face, I'm going to quickly draw in a form for a head. There's going to be a line for my eyes, my nose, my chin, my forehead. Just draw a shadow for my eyes here. Just something quick and dirty just to get the point across. Now I'm going to draw my nose in here and I'm going to cast a shadow over my cheek. And so the nose is actually shadowing this surface here. This would be my cheek. And so because this is a form shadow here and it rounds up toward the light, I can render through into the light this way. and that works. But if I was to actually render out of this cast shadow, I'm rendering directly into where the light source hits here. And that's why you can see even here, it just looks very, very odd. So it's something to really be aware of. Never ever make that mistake. Always keep your rendering limited to form shadows and direct them toward the light from the form shadow. So this would be a form shadow here. This is a very, very hard transition. So I'm going to keep these lines very short. And this would be a much softer transition here. I'm going to draw a line for the side of the head here. I can softly transition this here. Go just a little bit harder here and along the cheek. And this is obviously a very quick and dirty example, but I just want to show you exactly the kinds of problems that I very, very commonly see people have and how to avoid it. Next, we're going to talk about line direction. For this example, I've got my light coming from the right side here, and I've essentially got a tube. An arm is just a slightly more complex tube. And so my shadow is all along the side of the tube. If it were a simple tube, my shadow would just be here in a very simple way. And so using that simple tube, you can see that this represents the contour of my tube on either end. My framework essentially along the tube curves in the same way that both ends curve. So you're just following the form. And I can also follow the form along these parallel lines here. And so using an arm, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to draw lines that represent the curvature of my forms along the form. And this is a pretty simple thing. It's almost like drawing Spider-Man. When you draw Spider-Man's webbing, you have to contour the lines around the form, and knowing that my arm is going in the same direction as this simple tube is really the key to that. And so I can also go along the form this way. And that's really all you need to know to be able to start drawing rendering that follows your form and actually helps describe the direction of your form in space. And so I'm going to do the same thing here. For this muscle here, I know that my overall arm has a curvature just like this. And so this muscle has its own rounding, basically going the same way. And so I'm going to render along that, using that as a guide. When I actually draw on a day-to-day basis, I don't draw these guides in. It's something that you really should be able to see just in your own head very easily, just from practice. Now, I'm going much shorter with this rendering, just like I showed in the previous example, just over here, because this is a much shorter transition. It's a much shallower shape that I have here, and so my rounding transition is much shorter, and so I'm following it with a shorter line. If I could have a similar kind of a shadow with a much broader form, and then I would go longer with the rendering. And because I know that this is a pretty small form, I want to keep my rendering very small. Or it would be a possibility just to not have any rendering at all. So quick and dirty, that's really how you get rendering to go around a form. Now, if I wanted to follow along this way, I could render along my form like this and kind of isolate my light up to the center here and soften some of my actual form shadow that way also. Before we move on to something a little bit more fun, I have one more example that I want to show. This is basically a very, very simple deltoid shape that would be your shoulder. And I've also drawn in just a simple grid to show you the direction of my form, both crossways and vertically. And so I have a couple of different options that I can use when I decide how I want to soften my shadow up toward the light. The first option, and the one that I most commonly use, I'm just going to follow my form lines upward. Let's just get this rendered in. It takes just a little bit of patience to make sure that everything's nice and even. And that would really be it right there. Another option that I can use is I can actually use my horizontal lines across the form. And so I'm going to come across like this. This is something that was a little bit more popular in the early 90s with image comics, more of a horizontal rendered effect. And so that gives me essentially the same effect. I'm just going the other way. I also can start to crosshatch, and I guess this really comes into exactly, something that really starts to describe the name, and that is, crosshatching. And so what I'm going to do is over my vertical lines, I'm just going to use these horizontal lines here. You do have to be careful because it can be very easy to start to overpower a picture by doing this. But as long as you are being very aware of the direction of your form, you can get something that's even more rounded just by using rendering lines from a couple of different directions. I'm going to draw one more shape quickly. Draw the same shape again. And this is a technique actually that was very popular with Frank Frazetta and Bernie Wrightson and those sorts of artists. And because I've got my lighting coming from here, instead of following my form lines, I'm going to follow still my form lines, but really I'm going to render up toward the light. And so I'm bearing in mind the shape of my form still. I'm just making sure that my lines actually go toward the actual light source. It can be a little bit more complex to work this way. I find it's easy for me to kind of lose track a little bit, but that's something that can be very effective. And you can see that it has a nice look to it. And then you actually can go upward the way that you would have before. In my first example, losing it just a little bit here. And I can also go crossways. And that's how you can get something that's very, very textural, using a lot of line direction without ever losing your sense of form and ending up with something that starts to look muddy and unprofessional. All right, so now that we've covered a bunch of theory and some of the reasoning behind the choices that we make, we're going to take a figure that I've drawn here. I've got my lighting defined in from the left, slightly to the front, and I went ahead and just drew in all of my shadows. It's really important to note that the only way that rendering is really effective, or cross-hatching is really effective on a figure, is if your underlying structure and your lighting is well established. It's possible to render or crosshatch without any lighting, without any shadowing at all. My preference is to crosshatch out from shadowing toward light to create a transition from dark to light. And so that's what we're going to do here. And so I'm going to start with his chest. And this is a nice broad form. And so I can go fairly long with my rendering. I don't want to get too carried away. And I'm just following the overall form of my underlying shape toward the light. I can break up my line just to give it a little bit more character. And now I'm going to do the same thing on the other pectoral here, just like that. And now on the other side, I want this to round up toward the light. And I'm actually rounding along my form as opposed to toward the light here, which I will do in just a minute. Give it just a little bit more here. And I'm using my cross-hatching to soften toward light, but also to define the angles of my forms. And so it's rounding along the form here, along the overall form of the chest. And so I'm going to define some of my shape here. And these lines are actually going much more toward the light than these, which are going crossways along it. And so now I'm going to go nice and soft again here over his shoulder. It's a very soft transition from light to dark here. And this is a bit of a harder transition here, and it goes toward being a little bit softer as it rounds down. So I'm going to start fairly short with my lines and just get a little bit longer as I go along. I've got a shape defined there. I'm going to follow along that and along through here. And I'm just softening all of these shapes up toward the light, making sure to keep these fairly small, because it'd be very easy for me to take my lines and just overpower the entire shape, and that's really not what I want to do. And now I've got an overall shape that comes along like this. So for my lats, I'm gonna come in just like this. And I don't want to overpower, which is why I broke up my line here just a bit. And you can see I'm taking my rendering, I'm going down from this shape here, and then just fading out my rendering line along it to soften it out this way. And now it's coming here. This is much more really toward the light with this shape here, and it also kind of nicely follows the shape of the form. I have a choice with the lower stomach here. I could go directly upwards, or I could round it toward the light. I think I'm gonna go for this example directly upwards. And it's a choice, and there's really no right way or wrong way to do this. You can choose either way you want. And I'm actually Because I rounded out this way with these lines, I'm going to start to match it here just so I can create a bit more of an overall pattern, just like that. Now, I'm going to follow the same basic shape that I did below. It's important if you go with a bit of a patterning, you want to carry it across your overall form and not start to deviate too much, or things can start to look disjointed. Same thing up here. These are very large, soft forms. I've got a costume detail here, so I'm actually going to break up my line along it and then come to it here. It just gives it a bit of a ridge there. There we go. The other side of the stomach, same thing. Render up to that line, and then I'm going to start just above it. And you can see, giving it that little break actually creates that bit of costume detail without me having to draw in another line along it. And so now for the rib cage on this side, I'm gonna follow along the form this way. I actually went upwards this way, so maybe to start, I'll actually mirror that on the other side here. Come along the form this way first. And now I'm gonna go along this way. These are much shorter lines because these are they're not terribly hard shapes, but they're much smaller shapes. And you can see I came much longer up here because I'm going for more of a hard ridge and just softening it as I go up. And longer lines always soften forms. Shorter, tighter lines always keep your forms harder and smaller. So now I'm going to come along this way and use a bit of cross hatching just to mirror along, follow my form up through here. I'm going to bring this down and under just by continuing my lines in this basic direction along this form here. I'm going to do a little bit of cross hatching on the lower stomach just to soften this just a little bit further, and I'm going to come along the form crossways just like this. And again on the other side. Breaking up my line, I want to keep these lines long, but I don't want to overpower with too much line, so I just break it up. For his bicep, I want to keep my lines coming along the form here, so I've given him a bit of a vein detail. This is something I should probably erase. He's got a costume on. That's really not something that he would have, so let's get rid of that. But I do actually want to extend my lines basically to that point because I've got a real transition. The arm curves upward through here and then has a bit of a hard transition and comes back this way. And so just using that as a bit of a landmark there, kind of helpful for me. I'm going to come up just along the form here to soften this way. To be very careful when you're cross hatching to not get too carried away. It's very easy to get over rendered and start to hurt the look of your picture. Now for his tricep, I actually want to curve upward toward my light just because it nicely follows the form. It's a similar kind of a shape that I had just right over here. These are going to be much tighter and shorter lines through here, and I'll soften it as it goes down. And as long as you bear in mind where your form rounds and how large your shape is and how hard your transition is, it keeps it very, very easy to keep your rendering in check and make it work. Especially this whole process is much, much easier when you really have your underlying shadow defined properly. A technique that I really like to use, and I'm going to do it here on this shoulder, I've got a very tight grouping of rendering here. And so when I go crossways, I'm going to go much broader and wider with it. And it gives it a bit of a extra detail without overpowering by going too tight with the lines. I can do a similar kind of a thing on my shoulder here. Because this is fairly tight, I'm going to go much larger this way. And I can kind of define my form that way without overpowering because I'm just changing up my sizing. I want this whole area in here to be not dark, but fairly shadowed. And so I'm just going to use my rendering just to push that little shape in there back. My overall neck form is going like this. And so I'm going to follow it. These are going to be much shorter lines because this is a bit of a harder transition there. Very, very small little lines there just to define that and just soften it slightly, but not too much. And so for the face, I want to soften underneath the mouth down across the cheek this way here. And I also want to define my jawline here up around the side of the head this way. He's got a mask detail on his chin. I'm just gonna angle that whole piece away from the light, just using some relatively flat line work. I want his cheek to be softer here, so I'm just gonna render that in. I can render along his nose. It's small enough that I think that might be a bit of a mistake. But when you have a really hard transition at a small size, you're probably better off to just leave it alone rather than try to render out of it. I'm gonna soften some of his frown detail. To be very careful to keep this pretty light here. At a face this size, too much rendering can really overpower very quickly. And there you can see once the actual shadowing is in on a figure, you really don't need a lot of cross-hatching to get something that looks very, very detailed. And it is very easy to overdo this process. And you can see, I think for a figure just about this size, I've got about all of the rendering and all of the cross-hatching that I would want to put on this before it would start to really just close in. It's a bit of a push and pull process to learn exactly where that point is for you, where you'll have cross-hatching that will add to your picture and where continuing to add it will start to take it away. I do hope you see just how important your underlying lighting is to making this sort of cross-hatching work, and how this is really used to show its volume and space, and also to soften and add believability to your forms.
All right, that wraps it up. Thank you so much for watching.
Thank you, David. That was an awesome demo. If you guys enjoyed this, go check out David's YouTube channel, appropriately called David Finch, where he's got tons more videos like this. You can find more of his art on Instagram at dfinchartist or on his website, davidfinchart.com. You can also find his work in a bunch of Marvel, DC, and Image comics. If you guys enjoyed this demo, let us know in the comments, and we'll be sure to do more. See y'all next time.